In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can use ZBrush with Transpose Master and then push our mesh over into Maya, set up a skeleton inside of Maya, then do our weighting and do our posing inside of Maya, and then push that information back to ZBrush to do our final posing. So this process is going to be very similar to what we looked at before. We're just going to go to the Z plugins area. I'm going to load this, and I'm going to go ahead and click this and dock it over here into this area. If you don't see that trough open, just go ahead and click this little arrow area right here, and that's going to open it up for you. So again, if you just click and drag this little icon right here, you can click and drag it over to this side if you want. So we're opening up the Transpose Master, and then we're going to go ahead and create our T-Pose Mesh if you don't have one of those created already. Just go ahead and hit T-Pose Mesh, and it's going to look at whatever subtools you have visible, and it's going to take those, drop them down to the low subdivision level, and then make a new mesh out of that. So I'm going to go ahead and click this T-Pose Mesh like this, and it's going to go through this process of going through each one of these meshes that we have, dropping it down to the low subdivision level, and then it'll generate a new model out of all those pieces. So in this model that I'm working with, the resolution on some of the pieces are fairly high, but it's going to be okay. It'll actually work with that. It's just going to take a little bit longer to generate the model. So you can see here is the model that it made. It says T-Pose 1 underscore, it was called Fling Body. So I actually had one kind of already in the program already that I had from the earlier session. So just to make sure I don't get confused, I'm going to take that old one that's got some pose information on there, and I'm going to delete it out. So I'm going to go to the subtool area, and I'm going to hit delete right here just to get rid of it. It'll make this new star thing. I'll just go ahead and click back on over to that T-Pose mesh that it created for us. And this is what I want to work with, and I want to push this on over to ZBrush. So to do that, sorry, I'm going to push this over to Maya. So to do that, I'm just going to use the Go Z button, and I already have a session of Maya open, and it should go ahead and take that mesh and push it over and import it into the program. So I'm going to hit W for the move tool, or I can click this right here. I'm just going to move this off to the side so you can see kind of what's going on. Let me go ahead and turn off my grid right here. So here is the model that I had already inside of Maya. And you can see this one is got all the different pieces separated out. So what I did with this before I got started is over inside of ZBrush, I just went ahead and took this model, and then I did a Go Z for everything that was visible. So if you do Go Z all, it's going to push everything that you see here. I'm not sure if I've got some pieces actually hidden in here. I'm not sure if it's going to push all those over or not. You can just get rid of the things you don't need if you don't want it to push over. But that's how I got all the different pieces over inside of Maya. So I'm going to hop back over here. So this workflow I'm going to show you is what if you want to keep your model separate like this, but then when you get to the end of everything you're creating, you want to actually pose the entire model, but you still want to keep everything separate inside of Maya and maybe weight this up with a skeleton. That's the thing I'm going to be showing you. I could go and make a skeleton directly for this model and start posing it and everything else like that, but I do want to show you how we could keep all these pieces separate and then still push the changes to this, and then this model will go ahead and get updated inside of ZBrush. So some other things is when you push over from the Go Z application, sometimes the shading doesn't work out quite so right, and there's some hard edges and things like that. I usually just select the model, and in this Maya 2016, I'm going to go to the modeling area right in through here, and I'm going to go Mesh Display and say Soften Edge, and that will take the display and soften all the edges on this thing. So I'm going to delete history, Alt-Shift-D to delete the history on that. And so then now I'm going to keep the name T-Pose Fling Body like this. And so I should be pretty good for that. The only thing that I think I'm missing on here is the staff that I've got. So I'll hit Shift-H to unhide that. So you can see I've got this staff that we've got here in the back of the character, and so now we've got everything that's matching up. And if I put him back at 0 for the translate X, you can see he's in the right position where we need him to be. So let's go ahead and take that model and hide it. So I can hit Control H for that, You can see all this display stuff is up here for hide and show, and you can find the hotkeys for that stuff. So I'm going to hit Control H to hide that. And then now we're going to build a very simple skeleton for this character. And I'm going to definitely want something to make sure I'm got something in the neck to pose the neck, a little bit of a spine, and then at least some kind of skeleton for the arms that we see here, and maybe the fingers, and we'll get into the legs here. So in order to start making a skeleton, we're going to go to change this from modeling to rigging. And when we do that, you're going to see it's going to open up this area that says skeleton. So let's just go ahead and tear this thing off. Just going to click that and I'll tear it off here. So you can see we've got this create joints, and we could go to the option box and we could take a look at everything that is set up for the options for this. I'm just going to leave it to what the defaults are, but I definitely want to make sure this primary axis is set to X. I think it's on that way by default, and if you want, you can just reset your tool. So looks like those are just the default settings on there. So if I go to create joints, it's going to put me in this mode where I can start clicking and making joints on here. So I'm going to tap the spacebar and go to my side view, and I'm going to start with something that would be the root of the character, somewhere right in here for maybe the pelvis here. And depending on your scene setup, that joint looks huge, so I'm going to go to display, go to animation, and I'm going to go to joint size right here. And you can see that if I pull this window over here, that we can take this slider and get this about to the right size that we want. So visually, however you want this, I think I want my joints to be somewhere around that size. Again, this number is going to change depending on your scene setup. So once I get that set, I should be good to go. So now I'm just going to go ahead and click here. I'm going to click here, maybe here, like this. One more here at the base of the neck. And then I'm going to do one right up in here. I could do something for the eyes too. So this will be the stock or the root of the eyes. And then I'll just click and drag out one more joint, and I'll hit enter. And that's going to make a joint chain for us. So again, because we went to the side view, and I'll tap the spacebar to get out of here, you can see that it made it right down the center like that because we were creating this on the side. Now, if we take a look at the joints and we go to the movement thing here and then go to object, you can see that each one of these orientation of these joints, if we select it, is going to be pointing at its child like this. So let me just go ahead. I'll use the up and down arrow key on the keyboard just to cycle through these because it's wanting to pick the mesh. But you can see how this is pointing at those different joints. Now the last one we created, if you take a look at it, it's pointing straight up in the world. The reason I created this one way off here like that is I'm just going to get rid of it. I'm just going to delete it. And that was to give me this orientation of this joint right here. So it's not super important, but it's just something that I like to do to keep things kind of straight. So if we go now to the front view, and I'm looking in wireframe view, so again that's 4, if you tap 5, that's shaded. Now there is a mode in here that you can go and say shaded, and you can do X-ray joints, and then that way you can see the joints through the mesh, and that comes in pretty handy whenever you're creating skeletons. So I'm going to go back to this joint tool. Again, that sits right up here under skeleton, create joints. And then now I'm going to make something for the clavicle right here like this. I'll go ahead and make a shoulder. And then I'll make something that's close for the elbow. And then something for the wrist like this. Before I do this, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag it out. I think for these purposes, I don't think we have to be super picky about the skeleton. Normally, when I create skeletons, I have to be pretty strict with myself with how I create these, but because this is just kind of a temporary skeleton and not going to be the final skeleton that would be something that would go in the game, I'll go ahead and be kind of loose with this. And so you can see I'm just kind of going to the side, and I push that clavicle forward. So you can see it's kind of right up about here, and then I set the shoulder roughly about the area where the shoulder should be. And then I'm I want to actually take this and try to rotate the joint where it needs to be. So let me check the settings for the rotation, and you can see right now I've got the orientation of the joint set to world, or the rotation tool set to world. Let's go ahead and put that on object, and you can see now it takes on that orientation of the joint. And now I want to rotate it to where that joint kind of sits right in the back of the elbow. So I'll take this and I'll tap W for the move, and because I'm in object, I can just push this straight down like this, and that's becoming the pivot point for my elbow. I do want the elbow to be in just a little bit, right about there. And then now I can take this and I can rotate it down. But I want to show you something real quick about this orientation of this joint. Whenever I created it, if I hit Control A and I take a look at the attribute editor for this, you can see that there is this, it's called the joint orientation. And I've got this rotation on here. I don't want to get too technical about things, but basically we can just take this number here at this end joint and hit 0, and you can see how it changed the orientation of this and it made it go straight down. If we select this bone and we take a look at it, you can see it's got some rotation on here, and it's got a little bit of translation on Y. We really don't want any translation on there other than X, because that gives the length of the bone. And something for like an elbow, if we want to make sure that this thing bends, and you see how it's only giving me one value on X for rotation, that's what you really want for something like that. So again, this has got some joint orient on it. I can hit 0 for that, and you can see now it kind of straightens that thing out. And now I can rotate this into place. But I do have a character who has kind of these cartoony arms, and so we're going to have to match the skeleton as best as we possibly can with this. If I'm being really strict, and that's kind of what I'm doing right now by straightening all this stuff out, and I want this thing to kind of really work with what I've got going on here, I got to do a little bit of rotation up here on the top of the shoulder, and you can see what it does. It starts to push this joint towards the top of the skin, and that's kind of what you want for the rotation of this wrist. You want it to kind of bend from this point down a little bit. So again, I don't have to be perfect with this, but I can try to get it really close to where I need it to be. And then I can rotate this thing roughly about in the center of this thing here. So that's the wrist joint. And then now I can hit this and tap W for the move tool, and then just push this down just a little bit like this. Okay, so let's look real quick at naming. So I'm going to go turn on the X-ray joint so we can see this. So this will be the clavicle, and hold down Shift and click that plus, open that up. And if I do clav underscore L, I'll do capital L like that. And then this would be my shoulder underscore L like this. And if I do this one and say elbow underscore L, and then this will be my wrist underscore L like that. If I take this chain and I parent it to this part of the skeleton, and I might as well name this thing, name all these joints real quick. So I'll call this body root. I'm going to do underscore for that, like that. And I'll call this spine underscore 001. And then I can just copy that name and paste it and put a 2 and put a 3. Oops. Let's put a 3 at the end of that and keep going up. And we'll take a look at this, and I'll call this head base, just something like that. Okay, head underscore base. And I'll just call this head like that. And this will help me keep things organized. So I know I want to basically parent this joint to this joint right here, right in through there. So basically, whenever I rotate this joint and move the spine, I need the arm to follow along with it. So if I take this joint here, and I'll hit Q so I can get that manipulator out of the way. If I hold down Shift and click this joint here, and if I tap P, it's going to parent this joint to this one here. That's one way you can do it. I can hit undo real quick. If I know I need to attach the clavicle to the spine too, we could do it in the outliner. We can middle mouse drag it over the top of it. And you can see how it parents this to this part right here. So either way, it's up to you however you want to do it. So now I've got my skeleton set up for the arm on the left side. If I want to mirror this joint, all this joint chain across, I can just go to the skeleton and I can say Mir Joints. I'm going to open this thing up real quick and we'll take a look at the dialog box for this thing. So this is giving you an axis that you can mirror this thing across. So if I look at my little manipulator, our world axis manipulator thing down here, you can see that there's like this virtual plane. Here's Z and Y, like this. So I'm going to mirror this across Y and Z, and I'm going to search for, remember we wrote _L for the left side? I'm going to do _L because that's what I used, and then I'm going to replace it with _R. And then I'm going to tell it to mirror the behavior, and I can hit apply, and you can see it's going to mirror it across that axis like this. So the behavior, if you select your model or your skeleton over here and you hold down shift and select this one, if you put it on the rotation tool, as long as you've got this set to object, you should be able to rotate them both at the same time and get kind of like a flapping motion, like say like a bird or something like that. And you should be able to do one manipulator and manipulate both arms at the same time. So that's the behavior that you're going for in this scenario. So that's what the whole Mir Joints options will do for you. Let's go ahead and close that up. Now the other thing I can do, like I was saying, if I wanted to do something for the eyes, we can go back to that create joint tool. I'm going to go right here like this. I'm going to go to the side view and just go ahead and click one time for this. And I want to try to get in the very center of the eye for this. So I'm going to put it on the move tool, and we could scale the joint up if we wanted, or actually if I go to the channel box, you can see there's this radius. If I put that at 1, we can actually change the display of each individual joint. I'm just trying to get it as close to the size of that eye that we see here, and then I can kind of push this in place like this. Let's go to the front view, and then now I need to get this into place here. So if I tap 4 for the wireframe view, I should be able to get this joint pretty darn close to the center of that eye. Now the eyeball itself, if you looked at it, it's kind of turned in just a little bit, but that'll be okay. So I'm going to name this, and I'll call this eye, and we'll do the _L like we did before. Let's just go ahead and we'll parent it to this joint here, the head. So again, we could either select this joint first, hold down shift and select this and tap P. That's one way we could parent it, or we could just middle mouse drag it up there. However you want to do it. So we've got this left eye. Now we need a right eye, so we're going to go back to that skeleton Mir Joints. We're going to keep everything the same, what we did before, and just hit mirror. And now we have a right eye for everything. And let's see what else we got here. Let's go ahead and start working on the hips for this. So let's just go to the side view. I think that'll be easiest. Like that. I'm going to zoom in here. We're going to go to the Create Joints tool. Again, Create Joints tool right here. I'm going to click one joint for the hips, one for the knee, one for the ankle, and one for the base of the foot, and then I'll hold down shift and then click and drag out, and I'll just make another joint that's kind of flat out that would be maybe the beginning of the toes or something like that. So I'll just drag it right about there. I'll go ahead and hit enter for that, and you can see this is the chain that we've created, right? We could go ahead and name this. So this is hip underscore L for hip, and this is our knee underscore L, ankle underscore L. Okay, this is the foot base, we'll call it. This is foot mid. Let's see, mid, and I'm forgetting my underscore L's on some of these, like that. And we will do, this is the foot, ankle, foot base. Okay, I'm going to call this foot end, like that. And I've got everything ready for that. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this joint chain. I'm going to push it over to approximately where it needs to go for the hip placement. And I think that's going to be pretty good for that. Now we're in this situation where it looks like I need to rotate these joints into place like this. So again, because of these cartoon proportions, I'm going to have to not be so strict with myself, I guess, with the placement of some of these things. So let's see, if I push this here just a little bit, I want that knee a little bit closer to the outer edge of that. And so then I'll have to take this and then rotate it back. And I'm going to have to just rotate it this way. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep, remember, if we've got some funky stuff going on here, you see how we've got this rotate Z, and it's was giving me some rotation on X and Y. We're just going to have to change that. So you see how whenever I rotated it over this way just a little bit, now when I rotate it, it gives me rotation on 3 values, and that's what I was trying to avoid, but just sometimes you can't. So I'm just going to go ahead and rotate that into place. I'll take this and we'll move it down. And again, remember, we're looking at axis orientation is an object for that. So I'll just push this down here. We'll take this joint, and actually I'm going to take this and rotate it down here, right about there. And let's just go ahead and rotate it this way, like that. And I think I can take, actually I don't think I even really need this end joint, so I'm just going to delete it. Because if we make anything for these little, like, it says toes, but they're kind of like fingers, so we can have this be the start of that. It's going to go right here, down this area, into here, down this area, and here. So I think this is a good spot for that. Now, if I hit Control A, remember the whole axis orientation. If we do zero this thing out, let's take a look at where we're at with this thing. So basically, whenever I go to rotate the foot, I want this joint to be kind of already set up the way that I think would make most sense for rotating this thing. So I'm just taking the rotating manipulator, and then if you look at the channel box, you can see it's giving me these rotation values. And so I'm basically just trying to get this set up right now before we make any other skeletal stuff off the top of this, to where it would kind of make sense for anybody to grab this skeleton and start manipulating it. So one thing that we could do, you can see that after the creation of all this stuff, we've got this rotation on here. you're either going to have rotation here on the joint and the channel box area, or you're going to have it over here in the joint area. It's got to be in one or the other. It's got to store those values. But we could go to modify. We could freeze the transformations. If we do the option box for this, we could take a look and we could try to freeze translation, rotation, and scale. Translation will not freeze for joints, so you'll always have the positional data on that, but the rotational stuff will freeze out. And so if you do that, you can see it's still going to have the orientation part that we set up for it, but once it zeroes out, let's take a look what happens. It takes all the translation and it pushes it all to this joint orientation area, which is fine. Just know that that's kind of what's happening. So again, with this joint, I'm going to try to get this thing set up in a way that makes sense for us just to grab it and rotate it. But whenever I do that, because I rotate this, this is a child of this one, I'm going to have to fix this one right here. So let's go ahead and select that. Let's go ahead and do this here. And then I can go ahead and freeze transformations again. I'll go modify, freeze transformations, option box, hit apply. And I believe, let's take a look at this, it's freezing for the entire chain as it goes down like that. Okay, so this one's set up. Now we can just go ahead and take this and we can parent it to that joint. So here's something that I do know already. If you want the bottom half of the body to rotate independently of this top half, we have to basically make a duplicate of this joint, and they have to sit directly over the top of each other. So if I just select this joint, I hit Control D, you can see it's going to duplicate the entire chain that we have. We only need that one joint, so I'm going to select all these and just get rid of them. So really only want that one joint. There's other ways to do that, but I just found that that's pretty easy to do. So instead of calling this body root, I will call this pelvis root. Let's do this like that. And now I'm going to parent my hip left to the pelvis root. So here's what you see. Now I can rotate the legs independent, and the body will stay exactly the same. And if I want to rotate the body around, I can go ahead and do that. I should probably change the name of this from body root to let's call this body top root, something like that. And I probably want to duplicate this again and get rid of everything else other than that joint. And I'll call this just body root like what we had before. I think that'll make more sense for us. So basically what I'm left with is three different roots. A body root, and you can see when I go ahead and I'll parent the body top root to the body root, and the pelvis root to the body root. Now if I select the body root and move it around, it moves the entire skeleton. If I take the body top root and move it or rotate it, I've got control over the top half of the character. If I do the pelvis root, I've got control over the bottom part of the character. So again, this is probably a little bit more advanced for just what we're doing here, but really what I'm showing you is how to build a skeleton, and I might as well show you how to build a halfway decent skeleton, because that way you can reuse this information and pose your character a lot of different ways, right? The stuff that we looked at in Transpose Master inside of ZBrush, that's just a temporary solution to get you a pose, and then it's destroyed the minute you make it. So this one is a bit more last a bit longer, and you could do a lot more with it. So that's why we're taking some of these steps. So here again, we got this hip left. Let's go ahead and mirror that across. So we'll go to Skeleton and go Mir Joints. We've got that now. So now we've got the skeleton set up, and now we need to start working on the fingers, and we need to start working on the toes. Alright, let's go ahead and start working on the fingers, and to do this I'm just going to turn on the grid and turn that on here. And what I'm going to do is go back to our create joint tool. So we're going to be in the rigging area, and we're going to go to skeleton, create joints, and then I'm going to just hold down X and then snap to the grid here. So I can use this area here, it doesn't really matter. For the fingers, I think I need a joint here at the knuckle and well, the base of the finger, and then the knuckle here, and then one in through here and an end. So I'll just tap X to temporarily turn on the grid snapping, and I'll make this, and let's do one more for an end here. And remember, if we want the orientation of that joint to be correct, we can just hold down X and hit enter. So we made one extra joint at the very end. Just select it and get rid of it. So basically what I want to make sure is if I select all these joints, and you can see if I open up in the outliner, this little thing here, if I select them all, we want this behavior to where if we click and drag the rotation manipulator, that it does this kind of rolling or whipping motion with the skeleton. So that's going to be pretty important for something like the fingers. Let's take a look at the joint orientation on this real quick, and you can see depending on how we created this thing, since we made it go down the grid, it's going to orientate that first joint, and we've got some translation on X like what we want, and everything else is zeroed out. But it's going to, if we want this thing to be zeroed out when we first start with the joint orientation, we do have to do something like this here, where if we zero that out, you see what it does, and it makes the joints flow down the X direction. So if we rotate this thing, you should see it's actually rotating along Z, which is fine. We do want the translation along X, so I think we're fine there. So I've got the basis for what we'll use for the finger here. Now I do know already looking at this thing that these things are pretty darn far apart, so I'll just move them in a little bit closer like this, and that will give us the basis for things. Now if you want to snap to anything in like a vert, so this part of the skin there, if you put on your move tool and you hold down V, see how this manipulator kind of changes, and you can see this kind of going on here. This is vert snapping, so we can hold down V and then just click and drag, and you can see it should snap somewhere around to the part of the finger that we're looking for. I'll just tap F to frame on that particular area, and then now I'll just use not the scaling tool, rotate. So I'm going to rotate this into position. And these joints, the visibility of them and their display is pretty darn big for the fingers. So I'll just go over here to radius and put this at like 0.25, and you can see it's going to get them nice and thin over there. So again, the display of your joints can be different. So I'd like these to be pretty nice and large, but I don't want the fingers to be. I'm going to turn off the grid and just get rid of that, just so we have less things to kind of worry about and look at. So again, I'm going to put it on the rotation tool, kind of get this thing rotated into place like this. And this will take just a little bit to get these all kind of positioned up. So again, I'm going to get this closer here, move that up. And again, if you remember, if we double click on this movement, we want to make sure that we are in this object orientation. That allows us just to push these bones back in just that that X dimension here, like that. So again, I'm going to tap F, and you really want to do this with your joints. I'm tapping F, and I always kind of rotate around because you get a different vantage point, and it really helps you understand where is the actual orientation of that joint. So I might have to get this, match up this angle, and then I can push this back with the movement right there, like that. I'll do rotate this one down now and try to match this angle. Now I do want to make sure I'm only rotating in one area for the rotation here on this. So just kind of be mindful of that, and then I'll push this back right about here. And I do think these joints, kind of like the elbow, you want this more towards the top of the skin here. The knuckle, you want that a little bit more towards the top, and same thing for this little end finger thing here that we got. And then I'll just take this and rotate this down at this angle. This will become the finger end. We'll just get rid of this joint here. Don't need it, so I made one too many. But that's fine. So let's just really look over this thing and really kind of finesse what we're looking at and make sure it's giving us the results that we're going to be looking for. Now this one's going to have rotation on all, this root is going to have rotation on all three. You're just not going to be able to avoid that. But everything else should have rotation only in one particular area. Now that is, unless you have a character that's got really funky, weird proportions, but most of the time you're going to want your finger to, you know, just kind of curl up, just like what we did before. So after we get this moved into place, we can do this little test where we select all the joints. I'm going to select here and hold on Shift and select that, and now I can rotate. And you can see I should be able to get the finger to open and then close pretty easily just by using one of the axes for the manipulator here for this thing. So we'll call this finger base and do underscore left. This will be finger knuckle left, and this will be tip, I guess we could say. And it's up to you, whatever you want to come up with these names. If you have some kind of skeleton that's specific to mocap, you might want to think about something like that, but I'm not really too worried about it. Finger end. And again, this is kind of overkill for what we're doing for, you know, a setup for just posing the character, but again, if we're going to do the work, we might as well make sure we're using it in a way that we can get more leverage out of it and actually make a real skeleton. So after that's done, let's see here. Since I use finger, let's make sure I got this spelled right. Finger underscore like that. I'm going to need duplicates of this thing, so I can just select it and duplicate it. But I do know, let's see, maybe I want to call this finger pointer. So if I select this, there is this whole search and replace names. So if we take a look at that, that's under modify, search and replace names. So if I didn't do things correctly, like if I go finger and I want to search for finger underscore, and I need to make that into finger pointer underscore like that, and I can do selected or hierarchy, either one. If I go ahead and hit apply, see how it changes the names for you. So that's a pretty powerful tool, especially whenever you're dealing with a lot of joints and things like that with the skeleton. So now I can duplicate this thing. I'll hit Control D, and I'll just move this new joint over into place and then rotate it. And then we just got to kind of finesse this thing. Let's go ahead and take this joint and move it up a little bit. Right there like that. I think that's pretty good. So I want to make sure I'm rotating this joint into place. And then maybe I'll take this one, rotate it down a little bit, and I'll move this up right about here. So this is, I'm going to call this, instead of finger pointer, we're going to select everything, and I can copy this name because I used it before and put it up here at the top. So now I'm going to search for finger pointer and call this finger pinky, like that, and hit apply. Okay, so then that should be good. So now all I need to do is parent these joints up to the wrist, like what we got going on here. So if I select this, if I hold down shift and select the wrist and I hit P, I can parent it. So that's one way we can do it. Or we can select this joint and we know we need to parent it to this joint here. So you can always select it and open it up, and you can find out which joint is actually selected. See how this is selected here? Here's my finger, the one I already attached, so I could just middle mouse drag that right up to wrist. So you got two different ways of parenting these things up. So whatever is easiest for you. So I think that's going to give you enough information. I'm going to pause the video. I'll go ahead and create the thumb, and then I'll create these guys down here. I'll create the little fingers or whatever for the toes, and it'll be that same method that we have. We do have one thing to kind of worry about, and that is now we've got a hand over here on this side, and we don't have it on this side. So it's pretty easy. We'll just take this one side that we've got it created already, and we'll delete it, and we can just go back and use that Mir Joints tool. So we'll go to Skeleton and go to Mir Joints, like that. And again, if you want to look at the options for that, nothing's changed for it. So once we set that up, we can just keep using that tool. So you see how now I've got this hand pushed over here like that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this video, and I'm going to finish up the skeleton, and I'll come back and we'll take a look at it. Okay, here is the skeleton, and it's completed now. I'm going to go ahead and take what I made for the head, and I'm going to hide that real quick just because it makes it a little bit confusing at this point to look at some of that stuff. I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about it. So we already looked at how we created these different fingers and then the different toes, things like that. So nothing new there. You can see some of these additional things that I added to maybe help with the secondary animation for some of these pieces of clothing that this character will wear. So you can see for this cloth thing, I felt like maybe this amount of joints would do pretty good to be able to have control over this thing maybe swaying back and forth and things like that. And that's just a pretty simple chain. If I hit F8 and I grab that joint here, you can see that there's a mid chain, and it's just got a base and a mid and an end there. Same thing for the left and the right side. But I parented all that stuff to, if you remember the setup for the root, I parented that to this body root. That way everything moves along with it. And I made some joints for the very back of this thing too. So you can see back here, there's a back part of the loincloth for that. Since it's split in the middle, it didn't need anything there. So I just figured this will probably give me enough control over here on the edges. Now I did make one joint for these saddlebags. If you wanted these things to stretch and things like that, you would obviously need more joints, probably a joint in each one of these corners. But I felt just moving this thing around at least as one piece will be enough, and then I can increase the influence to kind of work on this rope a little bit. So if I take this joint and if I was going to move it around inside of the world, it would kind of move this saddlebag mainly and then kind of stretch some of these pieces around it just a little bit. So that's what was done for that. And then I also wanted some similar kind of motion for the necklace. This is supposed to be like a hard bone piece. So I made this little kind of skeletal setup here where if I move this part, it'll move this and this along with it. So you can see that these joints are parented to the base of this thing. The end of this doesn't really do anything. The ends are just kind of there kind of for visual feedback for you as the artist. So also for these little pieces, so there's a joint here and an end piece here. And then whenever we paint the weights and do the fall off, it's going to fall off along the length of this thing. So you should be able to take this whole piece and move it around and kind of move that thing. And then you'll be able to individually move these little pieces if you wanted some additional control for it. Now you can see that we could also take these pieces and you can do things instead of just translating them. You could rotate them so you could get some sway back and forth, things like that. There needs to be one joint for the staff, so whenever that's weighted up, you're going to be able to take that joint and you can position the staff and translate it and rotate it. I made a joint chain for the tail, so I just started with a new root and kind of pushed out this way. If we take a look and we see the naming convention for this, I just try to be somewhat consistent with what you guys have looked at for this. This is tail base, tail 01, 2, 3, and this is the tail end. So it's really up to you how you name those things. Now this is not something that's specific for Maya or for ZBrush, but I made this world joint and it sits at the world origin. If I was going to push this over to Unreal or maybe another game engine, I think that becomes kind of important at that point. So I'm just kind of used to making that joint anyway, so I go ahead and make that. If you make that world joint, everything is parented to that. So you can see if I close this stuff up, we got the staff as parented to that, and then the body root for the whole body is parented directly to that. So that one joint will actually move everything on this character, okay? And that just sits at the world origin for this thing. Some other things to note. This head. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we'll go ahead and open up this body root and go all the way to the part for the head. So we had this head joint before, and what I did at that point was said, let's go ahead and hide everything except for the jaw and the tongue. So I'm going to select these and just hit Control H to hide it, which that doesn't really, I was hoping it was going to hide these bones too. So this is the jaw, that's the hinge spot for where the mouth is going to open, and you can see that this will open this here. Now I've parented these joints to this, and this one is for this chain that you see right here is for a tongue. There's actually a piece of geometry inside of here that's made inside of the mouth bag for a tongue. And when we open the mouth, then you should be able to manipulate that tongue and move it around. Let me go ahead and show back the visibility of these. So I'm going to select this and hit Shift H like that. Now, for some of this other facial stuff that's going on, you really only need points on the surface, and you can kind of manipulate this. So you can think about this point here. If this thing's weighted up and we click and we move it around, it's going to have an influence over this area. So for this, I just call this as my cheek left, and you can see everything's parented to the head bone. So this whole setup, whenever we rotate on the part of the neck, all these joints are going to move along with the head, and that's what we want. We want everything to follow all the animation that's being driven on the neck up to the head, but then these individual joints will be able to have their own animation at that point to drive things for facial. So some of the things that I added were, these are going to be for the lips. So this is something that I called lip top mid, and then this is lip top mid side, and then this is top lip side. Again, the naming doesn't really matter. It's up to you, whatever you want to name this. And then we've got another joint in the corner for doing smile and stuff like that. So these joints are all parented to this part of the head up here. All these joints down here for the bottom lip are parented to the jaw. So then that way, whenever the jaw opens, it pulls down the lips and everything else with it as well. And I do think that's going to be important for you. And then for the eyelids, this is not a crazy setup that I got on this, but you can see there's 1, 2, 3 joints at the bottom lid, and then at the top there's 1, 2, 3 joints at the top, and then I got 1, 2, 3 points above for what would be considered an eyebrow or something. Now, anatomy wise on this thing, this guy really doesn't have an eyebrow, but you could start to pick these points up and move them around and get the appearance that there's some flesh moving around for the eyebrows for that. So I think that's going to be a fairly standard setup for maybe a face. Now I do have some controls on here where this would be the middle of the nose, and then this will be a left and a right And again, you really need to think of these joints being just areas of influence that you're going to be able to pick and move around and kind of deform the face with. Okay, so that is pretty much the joint setup. I guess the only other thing is this backpack that we've got back in here, like this. One thing I did notice whenever moving some of these joints is something that you might want to look at. We were moving in object space, and that seemed to work pretty good. I did have a point where this was not giving me the behavior that I was hoping for. And so if I wanted, we could also use parent, and you can see that it takes on the orientation of the parent joint. So there might be times where you want to move that thing just in and out, and object was not giving me the results that I want. It's going to be doing it at this axis. So depending on what you want, you might have to switch between object and parent for that, for these different things. So that concludes how to basically set up the skeleton. Now we're going to have to take a look at how we actually take the skeleton and we bind this mesh to the skeleton, and then once we bind the mesh, actually meshes to the skeleton, we'll have to go through a process of weighting those parts up so we can actually start deforming the model. One last thing before we end the skeletal creation is this is a little bit more advanced, but there's times whenever you have an arm, and to reduce the strain of taking this thing and rotating it on this point, something like this, and then maybe taking the wrist and rotating it here, you want to distribute this deformation along this entire area, because you get this really weird kind of like if you look at a sausage and you took a sausage and you, or a balloon, and you twisted it, and it starts to do this this bread tie kind of thing in the middle of it. That's kind of what happens with the geometry if you don't have enough joints supporting this to kind of roll through here. So they've made a tool to make that pretty easy for you to go ahead and put and insert joints in here. If you go to skeleton, there's an insert joints tool, and depending on your vantage, what you're looking at, if we just click and drag here, you can see it's going to automatically drag out a nice straight thing for us. That's because this is a nice straight thing going between these 2 points. And maybe I'll put a roll joint there, and maybe I'll keep it. Let's do this again. And let's drag it out about there, and I'll drag out another one and put it right about here, like that. And I'll do the same thing for this forearm. So I'll click and drag here, and I'll click and drag right about there. Now you can see the thing that we need for this is for this to be nice and completely straight. So normally what you would do is, once you get a rig kind of set up, is whenever you do rotation on here, you actually take maybe just a little bit of rotation from the shoulder, or you actually kill all the rotation from the shoulder and you push it to just these joints to where they start to roll like this. And so you can see how that gives you the motion that you're looking for the rotation, but then that way it's not tearing up your mesh quite so bad. So you're really evening the amount of distortion that's going on through your mesh through those different bones. So I'm going to hit undo just to get everything back into place. And so then I'll just go ahead and go through this and rename these joints. So that's the conclusion of what I wanted to show you for the skeletal creation. The next one will be for us to go ahead and do the binding and weighting.